Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome back to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast Summer Short Series, where we are getting super nerdy details on specific subjects all summer long while we gear up for Season 3 of the podcast in the fall. If it ever sounds like I'm whispering, it's because I do this really early in the morning. Anyway, today on the show, we have Mr. Neal Kinsey of Kinsey Ag Services. Neal is the author of Hands-on Agronomy, which is a really great book. He also studied under Dr. William Albrecht. And I wanted to get an agronomist like him on here to come on and answer for us some of my big remaining questions about deep compost mulching, also known as no-dig. And they kind of are as follows. How do you test the soil in that sort of system? How do you balance the soil in that sort of system? And do you see any issues? I mean, specifically things like phosphorus. So his answers are really helpful. Of course, like all of our summer shorts, this episode was brought to you by you. You are the ones who make this work possible. You, the patrons at patreon.com/farmerjesse. You, the people who kick us a few bucks at Venmo. We are so incredibly grateful. There are hundreds of dollars of expenses that go into it, hours and hours of labor. We'd love to see that Patreon page hit $2,500 by the start of the Season 3. We hope. That would be huge for us. We'd be able to do more video and etc. So consider kicking in a few bucks if this show or any of our other work has provided you some value at patreon.com/farmerjesse. Or like I said, just throw us a few bucks at Venmo to @NoTillGrowers just to say thanks. That helps too. But if you go the Patreon route at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or like this week, if you've been a patron since the beginning, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Jackson Roulette, Anthony Smith, Dean and Jennifer Mullis of Laughing Owl Farm, Jim Schultz, J.M. Fortier, Kevin Keene, Ryan Goser, and Yannick LaPlante. Big thanks to all of our supporters, and enough from me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with Neal Kinsey of Kinsey Ag Services. Okay, so the system, I kind of want to describe it because it's very kind of specific to intensive vegetable culture. And I know other people use it, but it seems like it's much more flower growers and stuff, but it's not like a big crop, cash crop kind of system. So essentially what it is called the deep compost mulch system, where growers are layering kind of a large amount of compost on bare soil that's either been tarped or tilled. It's just prepped. It doesn't have grass growing. So it's just, compost on top of soil. And then they plant directly into the compost. Obviously, the roots do eventually make it down to the native soil, but the primary medium here and mulch is the compost. So it's both a mulch and a medium. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that, like just how that works?
Well, first of all, do you have specific testing that you do that ascertains whether or not that really is compost or whether it's still manure?
Right. Well, it differs for every grower. So some growers may use something that's kind of vaguely compost, and then some may get it from a professional composter.
No, that's actually not what I mean.
Okay.
We get samples from a lot of, quote, organic growers, and they are using organic compost. And it turns out that it really isn't composted. It's still in the manure stage, not the compost stage. In that, until you get above 10 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, it really should be classified as a manure and not a compost. And Dr. Albrecht always emphasized that you should never plant in manure if it's gonna be something for human consumption, and you're going to use manure. Or put it on at least 12 before anything for human consumption in it. And one of his illustrations always was that chicken manure shows what can happen, and that is you. Are you familiar with that story?
I'm familiar what happens if you put down too much chicken manure.
Okay, well, I'm not talking about burning the plants or anything like that. I'm just talking about, let's say you didn't use anything that caused a problem that's obvious to the plants, but then you plant spinach or you used chicken manure in the last year and it really wasn't composted first. He said that when you plant spinach in such places, And even in heavy clays, people think, well, somehow sand got into the spinach because it'd be gritty. He said that's not sand, that's albumin from the chicken manure.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, in terms of first comment that I would have is that if someone's going to use compost and then they're going to eat from it, they really should want to know for sure they're putting it in compost, or else say, well, I'm going to put this on at least 12 months before I'm going to really plant something in there to eat that I'm going to grow to eat.
So a technical definition there of compost would be it has to be at that 10 parts to 1 part ratio to really
10 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen or higher.
Or higher. Okay.
Now you can actually put so much carbonaceous material in, like mixing a bunch of sawdust in there, and then you'll finally get it up where it's above 20 to 1, and then you say, well, we really don't have compost there either. It's still undecomposed carbonaceous material. So the first definition of compost is it needs to be 10 to 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen.
Okay, that's a good solid conceivable definition, because I think that it's not always thought of in terms of the carbon to nitrogen ratio.
Yes, and you know that's the first thing you look at, and if that's out of kilter, then you can say, well, we really don't have compost yet.
Right. So okay, so for sake of argument, let's assume that that the growers are using something that is technically fits that description.
Okay.
And my question is, if somebody wanted to use that system, so they're using the compost as a partial medium, but also a mulch, and then their native soil is just underneath that by about 4 to 8 inches, depending on who's putting down the compost. Well, I guess, do you see issues with that? And then the second part is, how would you soil test and mineral balance in that system?
Well, first of all, there is a couple of other things that I would see that could be problems if you're planting your seed in that compost, and that is we see many composts when we analyze them as soils, and we have quite a few people who will have a compost analyzed as a soil because they say we want to balance it out just like we balance out a soil. And many times what we'll find is that the potassium levels are so high, and that means above 7.5% potassium. In other words, the total compost, at least 7.5% of that total compost is available potassium. What happens once you get above 7.5% potassium? First thing is it ties up the boron. Starts tying the boron up in the soil. It doesn't tie it all up, but it starts making more and more of the boron unavailable. And since so many soils are deficient in boron anyway, it just makes that problem worse. Secondly, if the potassium and sodium together total above 10%, it'll block the manganese out, and it doesn't tie up the manganese. You can have a 2 times, 3 times more than you need in that soil, but it won't get into the plant. And the higher that percentage is above 10% between potassium and sodium, the harder it's going to be to get the boron and manganese above 7.5% for the boron. By the time it gets to 10, it's really causing a problem with boron, and that actually ties boron up. But it doesn't tie up the manganese. It only blocks it from getting in because the potassium and sodium crowd it out. It just can't get through the soil solution fast enough. So on potassium, that's the issues. As far as calcium, we generally find that most composts are quite deficient in calcium, down in the low 60s and so forth. And if we're going to balance that out to get a good growth, because calcium gets everything into the plant except calcium, boron gets the calcium into the plant. So in terms of then in that 4 to 8 inches of compost, if you don't have enough calcium there, it's going to be hard to get the proper nutrients established in it. All I'm saying here is, you're asking me, what do I see? These are the kind of things we see when people send us compost and say, we'd like to make a soil out of this compost. And you can put the nutrients there and get those balances, but compost is not generally really a balanced material. It's a material that you put on a soil that's relatively well balanced, and then it serves to help feed the microbes and so forth that's there. So if we've got a seed that's actually germinating in the compost, then the question is, do we really get nutrient-dense foods from it?
Right, because a lot of the nutrients may be locked up or unavailable.
Because of something else. Anytime you have too much of one thing, you won't have enough of something else. Or anytime you don't have enough of one thing, you have too much of something else. And in terms of the calcium, when we don't have enough, generally what we'll have too much of is either potassium or magnesium or sodium, or sometimes two or three of those. So there is a situation there where if we start our seeds out now, if you've already grown your seeds and you go out and plant them in that, to me that's a different situation, because the seeds already have a certain amount of nutrients and they'll run those roots down right quick to get into the soil down deeper. But if we plant the seed in that 4 to 8 inches of compost, then the question is, what kind of nutrient will we get in there from the very beginning in terms of that seed? And I'm not saying it'll all be bad. I'm just saying it brings up the question, well, did we get enough boron in? Did we get enough manganese in? If the phosphate's extremely high, did we get enough zinc in? And I generally tend to get a whole lot more concerned about the micronutrients that we have in our food than the other nutrients, because if you've got too much P and K in a soil, whether it's from over-applying manure, over-applying compost, the first signs of that will be bitter vegetables, and the ones that generally tend to show it will be things like turnips, squash, cucumbers. If you start to get bitter broccoli or cucumbers or squash or turnips, that tends to be an indication that the soil is too rich in P and K or too rich in compost and manure. And generally what we'll find is that's when the P and K will be really high in relation to the calcium.
Right. Okay. So back to our sort of hypothetical question. This is maybe something that somebody's interested in. They have a good source of compost, and they want to balance. They want to keep their soil balanced for those reasons, to have nutrient-dense food. Would you recommend getting a soil test for both the compost and the native soil?
If you are going to grow something immediately, it would be a good idea to test that compost before you put it on. If you're going to try to grow something immediate there and you're looking for the nutritional values of the foods because you're going to consume it or sell it to someone who is, if you've already applied the compost or manure and then you're going to be in a no-till situation, the thing that we would always recommend is try to take a sample of the top 4 inches of soil, whatever. If that compost or that you're putting down looks like soil, then just take the top 4 inches, because anything else you need to do that you put on top within the growing season is generally not going to be able to have any positive influence on anything more than the top 4 inches. If everything's going to be applied on top. So just any no-till, any lawn, any orchard, vineyard, pasture, anything that's not going to be worked, we just say take the top 4 inches and sample that, because that's going to tell you as much as that soil can stand for the next 12 months. And there, again, it's trying to make sure we can overcome any problems.
That brings up another question about sort of nutrient stratification. When you're adding these minerals and you're not tilling the soil, do you end up with like stratified mineral layers?
I'm not saying that you can't do that, because if you have a soil that you start out with that has certain compaction layers and so forth in them, or that tends to compact because of heavy traffic over them, then yes, we do have a potential for stratification. And some of the things that we're talking about that would be in that category would be Generally, what will indicate it the most is the amount of sodium that tends to accumulate. If you start seeing over time and you're taking soil samples and the sodium level, the sulfur level, the boron level, and chlorides in the soil begin to get higher and higher and higher, that means we have a bad capillary action. That means we have some kind of a compaction layer or some kind of an impediment inside the depth that we're taking the sample to. And so, yes, you can get into problems like that, but as long as we keep that soil open, and if you're using a lot of mulch and things like that, generally we don't really have that stratification kind of a problem. We don't run into that. As a matter of fact, we find that once we get the soils balanced out and so forth, it's almost like a perfect support system. On turf grass, for example, we'll have clients who have balanced out their system. They'll be watering the grass, running a thing over to cut the grass, and have a big semi there that they're loaded, and you go where they've driven right across that grass with a loaded semi and try to put a soil probe in there, and you can push it in just as easy as you can where they didn't run. So compaction is not really that much of a problem once we get what I say is a support matrix there, and the calcium and magnesium generally make that up. They really determine the physical structure of the soil. Now, I'm not saying you can't run something across there heavy enough that finally you're going to cause a compaction layer, but as long as you don't have an impediment in those top 4 inches, then I'd say it's not something we need to be that concerned about. And phosphate's the one that a lot of people talk about. But if you're using compost and the kind of phosphate level we find in most compost, I don't think you're going to have any problem with stratification. It's where people come in and just keep laying down phosphorus on top all the time and not correcting down deeper, where they generally will tend to have a problem with stratification.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about phosphorus for a second, if you would. Just how mobile is phosphorus from something like a manure-based compost that is fully composted, but does contain a lot of phosphorus? How mobile is that in terms of leaching into the soil, into the native soil?
Well, now, probably to get a real scientific answer on that, it'd be better to talk to a plant pathologist or something. But I'm just going to tell you some of the things that I've heard over time and that seem to be true. And that is, when we have a client that harvests his wheat, for example, and then all the wheat stubble is there on top, the plant pathologist will tell you, and I've never done any tests to show how fast this is, how quickly this comes about, but they'll say that straw doesn't even have to break down before phosphorus and potassium starts coming out of it, that the next crop behind it, for example, if you double crop peas or grain sorghum or soybeans behind a wheat crop, that the P and K actually, when it starts to rain, will begin to come out of that straw and be able to be picked up for the next crop. Does that happen in 3 days, or does that happen as soon as it rains? I don't really know what that time frame is, but soon enough that the crop's able to take advantage of it, the next crop that's growing there is able to take advantage of that. As far as looking at the phosphate in terms of availability from the soil itself, it just depends on what we start with.
Right. Well, what about excess? Like if you're putting down, I guess part of my question is, in a situation where you're adding a lot of compost and it happens to have high levels of phosphorus, what is the potential for that phosphorus to leach into waterways?
To me, the potential for the phosphorus to leach in the waterways is only if that compost gets picked up and moved away. Now, how is that something we can observe with our eye? Generally, what they'll tell us is the colloids that collect, whether it's an organic colloid or whether it's a clay colloid, that collect and hold the nutrients are so small you can't see it with the naked eye, that when you see the dust blowing across the field, it's picking up the most fertile part of your soil first. And when you see the water running and moving, any any sediment that you see in it, it's picked up the more fertile portions first. So to the extent that the water is able to pick up and move soil, then yes, we're going to be losing phosphorus. But if you've got soil that's intact and it stays in place, phosphorus is said to only move 1/4 of an inch from wherever it's placed. Now, the phosphorus itself, once the plants start using it and growing roots and so forth, as they grow down, they're going to deposit the phosphate deeper and so on and so forth. So the plants and the microbes and the earthworms and all the other biology in the soil is going to move that phosphate down as they work the soils. But as far as losing that phosphorus, once it's put into that soil, our problem that we have with phosphorus is if we have too much, what do we do to get rid of it? We can't find anything that gets phosphate out of the soil other than growing it out. So as far as to say, well, the phosphorus is it going to move on down through the soil and get leached into the water? We can't see that happening at all. It's a matter of the top runoff off the top. To me, that's the only way we're going to contaminate waterways with phosphorus or something. It's not. Now, E.K. Chandler, Esper Chandler, that had a soil lab in Texas, said if you used large amounts of compost or manures, that he had actually measured movement of phosphate as much as 3 feet down into the soil. I talked with him a couple of times on that in just a quick fashion, but never really did get a chance to sit down and find out what he was doing specifically before he died. There may be somebody that's followed up on what he had been doing, but he did say that compost and manure, the phosphate, if you put on large amounts, could eventually move out with the capillary water, but he didn't say under what circumstances. We have not been able to see that we can leach phosphates out of the soil, for example, and once the phosphorus is put where it's placed, for most crops, brassicas like broccoli and cauliflower and so forth, you got to have the phosphorus real close to them or they're not going to get it. But as far as like grasses and most other plants, the mycorrhiza fungi are what actually makes the phosphorus available and gets it into those plants anyway. So on a soil that has good microbial activity, phosphate availability is actually dependent on that microbial activity, and the real proof of that is when we had our 500-year floods in 1993, and I think the second one came about 5 years later, killed out all the mycorrhiza fungi in July and August, and it didn't have time to repopulate before spring. Well, all those farmers that planted and had really high phosphate levels on their soil tests and hadn't taken a crop off, still, when they didn't come and put a little bit of starter phosphate on, it made the difference between the corn being knee-high and belt-high because the mycorrhiza fungi just couldn't repopulate fast enough to get that phosphorus into the corn plants. It's true for other plants, just not as observable.
Wow, that's interesting. Doesn't phosphorus also limit like if you have excess phosphorus, doesn't that limit mycorrhizal fungi activity?
Well, evidently, it depends on what form of phosphorus you're using, because we'll have clients who use a lot of manure and have 3 times the levels of phosphorus in the soil. And if you, like, for example, talking about the 93 flood, we had one client that had 4,000 acres and they raised a lot of pigs, and they'd put pig manure on the 2,000 acres that they were going to go corn, and it was a rotation. So one year was corn, and next year was soybeans. The year they put in soybeans, they didn't put manure on that. They used the manure on the corn because they could use that for a portion of the nitrogen. Well, they had 3 times more than what we would say was an excellent phosphate level, measuring in those soils when they the year that they grew the corn and didn't harvest anything. So you come back the next year and say, well, do we need to put phosphate on here? Phosphate levels were sky high. But where they didn't put a little bit of starter phosphate, they still, the corn was between, where the corn was belt high with a little bit of phosphate, the corn was knee high where it wasn't there. So the mycorrhiza fungi actually repopulated because all they did was put just a little bit there to get it going. And then the corn just grew like everything once the soil was warmed up, so that we had 8 warm weeks. It takes about 8 weeks for mycorrhiza, and 8 weeks one way or the other. I can't remember the names of the other, but one of the researchers' name was Blue, Blue, and in the original USDA handbook on organic growing, they actually mention a test in there where they checked using anhydrous ammonia as a side dress, and it killed out all the mycorrhiza fungi, and it took 8 weeks for them to come back. That's in a warm spring condition because they put it on as a side dress while the corn's growing. And they said it took 8 weeks before the mycorrhiza could come back. Well, the mycorrhiza actually, I'm not worried about it. If we have way too high a phosphate, we may do something else that would kill out the mycorrhiza fungi. But in order to get the response from corn and things like that, we have to have that mycorrhiza or we're going to show serious phosphate deficiencies.
It's so interesting to think about it being lost. Like, I wonder how often that happens, that people lose, large populations of their mycorrhizal fungi in heavy rain events like you talked about in 93.
Well, the heavy rain won't do it. It's got to be in standing water, and I think that has to be for more than a week. But, when they had those floods came and they had corn in July that was already denting and soybeans that had already put beans in, but the water came before they got ripe and could be harvested, and it just destroyed the whole crop. But the water was there for weeks, and so that's when you can get concerned about killing out the mycorrhiza fungi. One of the places where we have to deal with that is rice farmers that keep their fields flooded for growing rice. Well, that flood kills out the mycorrhiza fungi. And then if the farmer has to come in and in a year, and hardly any farmer ever wanted to do this, he only would do it to meet regulations or something like that, then they have to come in and put the corn behind just following rice. You can have really good phosphate levels, excellent phosphate levels there, and still have a phosphate deficiency showing up in the corn because the mycorrhiza fungi hadn't had time to repopulate yet.
Route from that standing water. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And I feel like I heard recently, maybe it was on John Kemp's podcast, about somebody was talking about not, they were doing rice, a bunch of different stuff with rice, but talking about not leaving it in standing water as long. I thought that was really interesting. So maybe that's part of it.
Well, it is true that you don't have to grow rice in standing water, but most people use water as a weed control. One of the clients we have that raises rice actually raises his highest yields where they just irrigate the rice. But when you just irrigate the rice, you also have more problem with weed and grass control. So if you're trying to do it organically, it gets harder to do.
Right. Which is, I wonder if there's some potential for that in our no-till system. I'll have to do some trials with that, because we don't have weed issues. Weeds are like the part of the mulch, part of the attraction of using the mulch is that you're getting weed seed-free compost and you're layering that. And then as your growing medium, it's blocking any weeds, not any, but a majority of, even perennial weeds that are underneath. So it's producing food basically without any sort of cultivation necessity. Beyond just the application, your labor's shifting a little bit to applying the compost versus cultivating out the weeds. But yeah, that is interesting. That's something to think about. I'd like to maybe try some rice. Is there?
Well, years ago, I read a book, Ruth Stout's book, How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back.
Right.
And she was recommending using old salt hay or straw or things of this nature to raise a really good garden. I tried it; it didn't work so well first year. But my garden wasn't. We moved to a new place and used that, and my garden wasn't balanced out and had the right amount of nutrients. If you got a good rich garden, and you come in there and put all that straw and stuff on, then you can grow some really good crops there, provided you provide the nutrients. Once I got the nutrient levels up, now that worked really good. And it was sand where we live in a clay area right now, but at that time it was sandy, and we lived there for 40 years. Well, I actually could take my finger and make a row and plant in that sand. Didn't have to have a hole in it, just move the mulch out of the way and make a row and plant. it worked great, and it would keep the weeds down and so forth. But you got to watch out if you're using straight compost and don't put a mulch on top of it. If you are using a true compost and it's got hot enough to kill all the weed seeds and so forth, that's going to be great. But on a compost, generally the potassium saturation is above 7.5% unless you come in and put enough limestone to counteract that. And the only way I know to do that is to measure what the exchange capacity of that particular compost is. But if you get above 7.5% potassium, and we'll have organic growers that tell us this all the time, that's when you have the highest weed pressure of all. Certain weeds that really love an excess of potassium will turn out to come through there. That's one of the reasons older farmers used to say, I never put manure on my alfalfa because the weeds always come up where we spread the manure. Well, only because they spread it so thick, because it only comes up right behind the manure spreader generally. They spread it so thick that they get above 7.5% potassium. And when that happens, you will have a problem. If there's any weed seeds there that really love potassium, they'll take off and grow like mad.
That's interesting. What are some weeds that grow on potassium-rich soil? I'm thinking like grasses.
Well, spiny amaranth is one I think of very quickly because you'll see this in the Midwest where the farmers actually feed their hay, and they'll feed the hay during the winter, and then the cows spread out in the spring and summer, and they get out, and you come in there pulling samples in the summer, and the spiny amaranth will be right up to the line where they fed that hay, and the cows have stood and ate the hay and then the manure and so forth. You do, and wherever that spiny amaranth stops, on the other side, that's where you don't have the excessive potassium level.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you see the fields of spiny amaranth in poorly treated, pastures or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's all that seems to make a lot of sense. Can I ask you a couple more questions?
Sure.
I appreciate your time. I know it's a crazy week. With the applications of hay, I'm just thinking like hay is cut at a period when it's pretty generally good hay is cut, for fodder, is cut, when it has pretty high nutrients,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's pretty high, relatively high protein. And I'm just talking about grass hay, not specifically like alfalfa or something really special. But, general grass hay cut when it's green and has good high nutrients. And then you're taking that and applying it to the garden. Are there any issues that come along with that, or is that kind of a nice way to sort of bring those minerals into your garden? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, when all the mulch that I used, I wanted it to already be hay that had dried out, not fresh green material and so forth. Secondly, if I had a choice, I always wanted to get clean straw, because clean straw, now we didn't get weed seeds in it and things of this nature, which generally the weeds don't come through. But, if you happen to get something that's got a lot of weed seed in it, then you got to keep that mulch really thick, or else some of the weeds will tend to get through it. So always try to get clean straw. I always try to get clean straw from either wheat or oats or something like that, where they'd have a relatively weed-free field. If you go out and just take the grass right off of a pasture or something where there's a lot of weeds that have, and generally you cut the pasture, or not pasture, but a hay meadow, you cut it when most of the stuff hadn't gone to seed yet by the time you cut the hay. So you don't have to deal with that unless you wait until it's really older, and then you got weed seed in there as well. So to me, you can put it down. As a matter of fact, in an experiment on a vegetable farm in East Texas, they ate sand and they planted potatoes, and it was an organic operation, and they didn't want to spray with any poison sprays. They would use diatomaceous earth and so forth, but they ran out of diatomaceous earth, and the potato bugs were just chewing up all their potatoes. I mean, Colorado potato beetle. And they actually came in and used, just tried it to see how it would work, and they only put it on about 1/10 of an acre, but they were cutting green chop for silage that's going in to feed the dairy cows. And they took about a foot of that and put it in on those potatoes, and everywhere they put that stuff, the potato beetles stopped eating, and those potatoes grew right out and started growing again.
Wow. I wonder what the reason
I
for
don't know
that.
what it was, but I mean, just that was just now it was open pollinated corn, and they were growing it for feeding their cattle, and they were harvesting it, and it wasn't certified organic because they didn't go through organic certification, but it could have been easily certified organic. And they just came in there and put that on as a mulch about a foot thick, and the potatoes were sticking out the top. They were still out there, and there were even potato beetles on it. You could see them out there when they were spreading this. But you come back a few days later, and all the potato beetles were gone, and those potatoes grew out, and they ate the rest of them up.
Wow, that's so interesting. There's a couple studies like there's an orchardist up in I think she's in Washington or Oregon now, but she did some studies with green chop that she would basically do sort of haylage style cut, put it on her garden, and then till that in and use it in the spring.
Yes.
And she said that and she compared that. She did it scientifically. And she said that the yield and the quality of those crops was it was just considerable. And I forget the numbers, but it was quite considerable. And there are other growers who've been using lay fields, of clover and other richer grasses and forbs, etc., and then cutting that obviously before the seed stage, and then applying that to their fields as mulches. I don't know. I wonder if there's something more there that should be explored.
Well, when you take, if you look at what plant pathologists say, they say, whatever's been processed and gotten into a plant is the most available food source of that nutrient for once that plant decomposes, it's already been converted. And that's the easiest for the next crop that's growing there, the next plants that grow there to pick up and utilize. They'll take that first because it's already basically been converted for them by the microbes in the soil, and they don't have to reconvert it again.
That is an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it like that, but that makes all the sense. I mean, it's already bioavailable because the plant was already using it.
Well, you can take soil samples in a field right after harvest, whatever crop you're growing, right after harvest, and say it's corn. So you take the sample right after harvest, and now you're going to come back there and grow beans or corn again the next year. Right after harvest, the P and K will be the lowest you'll see. And then in the spring, when all the residues have had a chance to break down, and generally that'll be April or May, if you've already planted and you still have residues breaking down, it won't show up as fast. It'll show up, but once those residues are completely decomposed, that's when you'll see your highest P and K. But when they're decomposed to the point that they're broken down, but the plant hasn't started pulling huge amounts out yet. So you always see your highest P and K levels in the spring after all the residues have had a chance to break down, because everything that's in those residues, the P and K that's in there is the most available P and K you can find, and that's what a soil test is supposed to be measuring. What's there in the form that's available for the plants to use.
Right, and I mean that's probably that's a testament to cover crops, right? All of that material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cover crops do the same thing. If you take a cover crop and plant it in the fall and keep it on your garden or whatever, go out there and put compost on. I think it was in California in the 1990s. It might have been the 80s, but they did a study to see, well, if you put fresh manure on, what's the best way to conserve the nitrogen from it? They found out that some type of a grass crop that has lots of roots, like a wheat crop or oats or barley, was the best way. And they said, well, if you could get that to plant that and get it to grow there, it would actually capture 85% of the nitrogen that would normally be leached away. And that, as you work that green manure crop in or let it die and decompose the next spring, that nitrogen actually is taken up by the next crop and not lost and leached away.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I feel like that's something that has obviously cover crops have had a lot of attention, but applying them in a small sort of market garden has been a little bit more challenging because it's not necessarily the place that you'd bring in a roller crimper. People are figuring it out, but I feel like there's so much incentive to do that for reasons like you just kind of were talking about. Well, Neal, I think that's kind of. I mean, I could obviously keep asking you questions, but I think that's good for now. That kind of answers some of the big ones that I had. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Well, if it's helpful to you, I'm glad to be able to do it. And thanks for considering asking. If we can, the more good information we can get out for people on how to grow a more nutritious crop, the better it's going to be for everyone.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, and I wish you and your family health and have a great week.
Thank you, Jesse, and same to you.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode and you need some soil testing done, check out kinseyag.com. Also snag a copy of Hands-On Agronomy. I'll put a link in the show notes. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you are getting it so you do not miss out on our full-length interviews in the fall. Rate and review it and share it with a friend or all of your friends. You know, just because you haven't spoken since high school does not mean your high school crush doesn't need a good dose of no-till agriculture. That's a fact. Huge thanks to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Thanks, as always, to Hannah Crabtree for being the badass that she is. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.